Hello and welcome. You've just joined our first stream, which is working together to improve the system. My name is Sylvia Lappick. I'm the ACT Adjunct representative, and I warmly welcome you to our session today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land of the ACT people, the land of the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to both elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the contribution they make to this city and surrounding region. And I extend that respect to First Nations people who've attended today's virtual conference. So I might start with some housekeeping for everyone. So if you have any questions throughout the session, we have 3 sessions in today's morning session. So if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A on the right side of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the live support button at the top of your screen. And if you want to view this on the large screen, you can click the arrows in the right top hand of the video where I am now, and the screen will be larger. I will introduce each speaker and at the end of their presentation, we will ask the Q&A on the screen up until when the time allows. So hopefully we can get through as many of your questions as possible. The speakers basically have about 20 minutes, so hopefully we can get through the presentation and the question and answer section. Now, if we do go ahead, we won't go ahead of time. So if the session does finish sooner, we'll take that as an opportunity to stand up, stretch our legs, get a glass of water, and we'll continue the session as per the agenda that you would all have. All right, so housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to warmly introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is talking to the Encouraging Positive Improvement and Change, EPIC, a journey of best practice and workforce readiness. Our presenter is Kathryn Khademi, and she's from Youth Justice in New South Wales, the practice team. And Kathryn is a project officer for this team, and her current focus is on incorporating best practice and a positive behaviour approach. Kate comes with 20 years experience within the justice sector, a postgraduate degree in social work and an undergraduate degree in criminology. We warmly welcome Kathryn.
Good morning, and thank you all for the opportunity to present today and for attending this presentation on the EPIC scheme project. EPIC stands for Encouraging Positive Improvement and Change, and the scheme was designed to replace the traditional incentive scheme. This is our journey to implement best practice while managing. I would like to start today by acknowledging that I'm presenting from the lands of the Whānau people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections. So who are we? Well, I'm a project officer with the practice team, which sits within the Policy and Practice Directorate in Youth Justice New South Wales. We have a central function, which is to drive our approach and way of working with young people. Our primary aim is to achieve a consistent system-wide approach to intervention that is grounded in evidence and research. Part of our role is to create these initiatives to set the direction and practice. This project was a collaboration between the practice team, Acmina Youth Justice Centre, Induna School and the Research and Information team. This presentation focuses on our learnings from working to achieve change in a custodial environment and the process of negotiating best practice and workforce readiness. Does our practice initiative translate well to the real world? Is it operationally viable? These were the questions and challenges we had to overcome as part of this project. So what was the background to the project? Well, the previous incentive scheme was introduced in 2007. It had been inconsistently applied and had become part of the disciplinary system. It was very process driven, and a review of the incentive scheme was ordered in. So initiating this project, we started by reviewing the literature. We referred to 2 literature reviews, the Behaviour Management Review that had been completed by the Senior Project Officer Practice and advocated for a more trauma-informed, collaborative problem-solving and positive behaviour intervention and support approach. Our Strategic Projects Unit also completed a specific literature review on incentive schemes, and that points-based systems are largely ineffective, punitive, and not in line with trauma-informed practice. Young people need more individualised approaches. We then took this information and consulted with a cross-section of staff groups and young people through focus groups and committees across the agency. So our objective then became to enact those recommendations from the Behaviour Management Review by developing and piloting an alternative to the incentive scheme based on a positive behaviour intervention support framework and underpinned by the trauma-informed practice, incorporating collaborative problem solving. Our aim was to make behaviour management more individualised, to embed a positive reinforcement as a tool to improve behaviour. This resulted in a 12-month pilot of a scheme with an evaluation at Acmina Youth Justice Centre. But for this to work, we would need significant buy-in from across the centre, from young people and staff. So we then entered the pre-implementation phase, which was really critical to the project. The scheme itself went live in March 2020. 5 months prior to that, in October 2019, the project team established a working party in Acmina, consisting of a cross-section of roles from the centre and the school, as we were aiming for a whole-of-centre approach. The project team very much went to Acmina stating, we have these ideas and the outline of a scheme, but we need your expertise to make this operationally viable. The working party established on the scheme and to test the operational viability of elements of the scheme prior to implementation, to avoid unnecessary strain being put on the centre when the scheme went live. Focus groups were held with young people and communications began to encourage a 2-way conversation, allowing staff and young people time to digest that change was coming and the opportunity to ask questions and make suggestions, ensuring that they were part of the process and the initial design. We recruited an internal project officer to work within the centre, which was critical throughout this and all phases of the project. That project officer was already a well-respected member of staff from within the centre, which was vital as they already had established relationships and rapport with staff and young people, which meant that they were more engaged and felt comfortable to provide honest feedback. Prior to go live, all frontline staff were trained in trauma-informed practice, the scheme itself, and the foundations of Youth Justice New South Wales practice through our practice guide. The animation I'm about to show you was developed to explain the scheme and used to induct young people. It was played in a loop on their rooms, and posters were also displayed throughout the centre to increase understanding of behaviour expectations. Briefings were also held for all young people.
Hey, welcome to Acmina. Acmina has the EPIC Positive Behaviour Scheme. EPIC stands for Encouraging Positive Improvement and Change. The reason why it's called Encouraging Positive Improvement and Change is because we want to support you to behave in a way that keeps you and others around you safe and encourages you to make good choices. How does the EPIC scheme work? You earn cards for demonstrating positive behaviour. These cards can be exchanged for rewards. You can earn cards in 2 ways. First, by keeping to the Positive Behaviour Code, known as the PBC. The PBC targets 3 types of behaviour. Respect. You speak and act in a way that considers others. Participate. You join in with the activities on the unit and in the centre. Responsibility. You and act. You will be expected to make efforts to stick to the code. How will you know what to do? You will see posters across the centre and school to show you what it looks like to stick to the code. If you are going off track, staff will remind you of the code and make suggestions of what you can do instead to stay on track. Each day you will be able to earn cards for demonstrating that you have made an effort in at least 3 out of 4 PBC behaviours. So what are the 4 behaviours? I made an effort to treat staff and others with respect. I made an effort to participate in programs offered to me. I made an effort to be responsible for myself and my belongings. I made an effort to contribute to a safe environment. You can earn up to 3 PBC cards a day, 1 in each session: AM shift, school programs, work party, or PM shift. The second way you can earn cards is by receiving an EPIC card. These cards can be awarded to you by youth officers when you are seen to be making improvements in your behaviour. The youth officer will tell you immediately that you have earned an EPIC card and what you did to earn it. Before the end of each shift, they will write up the EPIC card and give you a copy. What can cards be used for? You can exchange cards for rewards. The programs team will visit you every Monday and Thursday to ask if you want to exchange any cards or save some or all of them for access to better rewards. The rewards ladder displayed on the unit will tell you how many cards you need for each item. Unit staff will use daily reflection sheets to keep a note of how many cards you have achieved each day and why. If you are unsure, you can ask to take a look to see how you are tracking or talk it through with a staff member. Every week, you will have a weekly reflection meeting with 2 staff to talk about how you are going, help you set goals, and support you to stay on track and stick to the PBC. Don't worry, everyone here is happy to help you understand anything you are unsure about. There are lots of people here that want to see you do well. Thanks for watching this video.
So that was the scheme that we entered Community Youth Justice Centre in March 2020. And in this post-implementation phase, focus and critical element to ensure that the scheme was implemented with programme fidelity. The on-site project officer and practice leads received additional training so that they were equipped to mentor and support staff and young people on the front line. And this really helped to engage them and clear up any misinformation in a timely manner. The on-site project officer reflected to me that resistance was good because it provided a platform to have a conversation about what was behind that resistance and open up that dialogue. With resistance came opportunity for shared learning. 4 months post-implementation, the process evaluation was conducted by the Research and Information Unit. Staff and young people were interviewed as part of that process, and their feedback was acted on. Any changes made in response to feedback received was clearly communicated, informing a constant process of negotiation between operational and programme needs. Booster sessions for training were created and facilitated by the on-site project officer to address any gaps in practice that were identified through the evaluation process. The working party met monthly initially to review feedback and data to maintain programme integrity. We created a monthly newsletter called Epic News, which shared data initially with all front that transparency between the project team and working party and those working on the floor. These processes and practices created a vehicle to gradually transfer the scheme from the conceptual project to the centre itself. As I mentioned, there was a process evaluation completed 4 months post-implementation and then an outcome evaluation completed 12 months post-implementation. Whilst there have been many external factors at play, COVID being one of them, that has significantly impacted on the operations within the centre during that time, results indicate that the scheme has shown promise and is worth continued support and monitoring. The following has been found. It was statistically significant that there was a decrease in staff belief in punitive approach through the punishment and control orientation scale. It was statistically significant that staff reported feeling safer through the experience of safety scale. The scheme itself was found to provide a platform for acknowledging positive behaviour that was not previously there. It helped to shift that focus to look more for positive behaviours, whereas previously the focus was on reporting on negative behaviours. Induna School also reported that there was a large increase in the number of positive comments a young person received at school, and there was a significant reduction in suspensions. The weekly review meetings carried out with young people and 2 members of staff have continued to be more engaging, and behaviour goals are being set with young people. This in part appears to be due to the fact that this scheme separates this meeting from incentives. So under the incentive scheme, the previous one, young people would attend those weekly meetings and find out if at that meeting, if they'd achieved their buy-ups for the week, and they'd also fill out their order form for their buy-ups. The focus of the meeting was all about whether they were getting their buy-ups or not, and it really had become process-driven and a bit of a tick and flick. But by separating the awarding of incentives from that meeting, it's reduced anxiety of young people and staff around that. And it's also allowed for that meeting to purely focus on the young person's behaviour and addressing problems and trying to set meaningful behaviour goals with them, and lends itself more to a collaborative problem-solving approach. Staff reported difficulty in responding to minor misbehaviours. Previously, they would have used bedtimes. So under the incentive scheme, a young person has to achieve a certain number of points to be awarded a late bed. And staff really struggled with not having this tool as they used that to address more minor misbehaviour. Post-pilot changes have been made to the EPIC scheme, and we've modified it to address these concerns. This was an area where we have to concede that best practice was not able to meet workforce readiness, and adjustments had to be made to be more in line with the environment and the strict restrictions within the centre. So what have been the lessons learned? The conclusions and recommendations from the evaluation are that we should continue to monitor the EPIC scheme at ACMENA, and that we should trial it at another centre, which will be considered for 2022. Staff have requested more training and coaching, and we need to continue to invest in that, as it's a really positive vehicle for achieving change within the centre. We've already planned booster sessions for next year on the scheme to be completed within ACMENA, and we would plan to reinvest in the practice leads as coaches. An evaluation, continued evaluation, and we will look at that for next year. We are very excited to see this grow and to continue to monitor the results of the scheme. Perhaps it is possible that EPIC is improving the system at the pace at which the system is ready, one step at a time. The following slide contains quotes from staff at the centre regarding the scheme and the change process.
Staff are taking the effort to have that talk about things they find positive and tell the kids. That probably wasn't happening before because they weren't looking for it. The scheme was more focused on the misbehaviour.
There were some workers that said, I will never give an EPIC card out ever. Some of the workers that did say that at the start have given at least 10 EPIC cards now. It's changed the way that those workers particularly think. So I can say it actually is working.
The best part about it for me is that it's in both areas that's the big winner for us, that we've all got one system. We can all work together on that system. So before it was PBL and the points over in the units, and it was 2 kind of different systems. But now we've got this uniform language. We've got this uniform behaviour expectation in both settings, in all settings. So not only in the unit, but on the oval, not only on the oval, but in the classrooms.
They didn't just turn up and say, this is the scheme. It wasn't just some phony I think it actually came across as quite genuine, and they were quite willing to change stuff. That was pretty evident, and I think that's why the working party got on board so well. I think there was fairly good lead-in time as well. It wasn't like I said, predetermined ideas and then they just rushed in and pretended they could solve it. I think it sort of created a prototype for how implementation is or can be successful in my mind.
Thank you very much for attending this presentation today, and please do not hesitate to get in contact if you have any questions on yjpracticeteam@dcj.nsw.gov.au.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kat. I think that brings you to the end of the presentation. I just want to thank you for a really informative session. I'm particularly impressed about your engagement strategies with the cartoon and how you've been able to engage young people in that process. So that investment in pre-implementation and implementation activities was just so valuable, and the outcomes and the evaluation findings are really promising. So thank you for sharing, Kat. We do have some questions in our question room, if that's what you call it. We have a congratulations from Marco Shaloub, who has congratulated the EPIC officers. Is there a public website about EPIC where people could perhaps see its goals, outcomes, or its data about it, Kat?
There isn't a public website, but we have got some information on our internal one. But if anybody wants to email us, we're happy to share information, and we already have done with some other jurisdictions.
Wonderful, thank you.
So just
Kat.
send us an email through, and we're happy to discuss.
Wonderful. We're getting loads of people talking about how wonderful the presentation is, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Akima Youth Justice Centre is located in rural New South Wales, and Gary Crawford was wondering, it does hold a maximum of 45 young people in 3 units of 15 young people each, and the ages can range from 10 to 18 years old, both on remand and control orders. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
wonderful. And you can see I'm new. I'm such a rookie at this, right? So apologies, everyone. I'm really getting excited with this. All right, so let me just read another question and see if you might be able to answer. So Kenny O'Brien has asked, how many young people are housed at the centre? Which I think I might have just answered.
Oh, so that's Gary's probably answered that in there, because Gary's done some work
thanks,
at
Gary.
before.
No, that sounds good. But look, we do have a last question. Did the program help to address the underlying causes of negative behaviour?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really been a big change through the scheme is those weekly reflection meetings. So as I said previously, they'd kind of really watered down in value and had become by, whereas now there's a minimum 2 staff at those meetings. One of the things that the evaluation did feedback was that people really welcomed psychologists and caseworkers being present, which is something that we really want to try and maintain. So they are present at some of them, but not all of them. And people have really found that really valuable. So really, by those meetings being a lot more meaningful and being able to then discuss and review the young person's behaviour and try and get to the causes, is okay, so this is going on for you. What do you think's happening here? How can we change it for next week? It's really allowed that to be explored a lot more and to try and address some of the underlying causes of behaviours. But it really does try also to take a positive behaviour approach, because I think in centres we often do can focus a lot more on negative behaviours and addressing that. And so we're trying to kind of restore the balance a little bit there and trying to say, hey, did you see how that young person improved over there? That's an improvement for them, and trying to make it more individualised. EPIC is an improvement for that individual young person, not across the board. So it's something that young person has improved on, and you're recognising that it is something that they're moving forwards with.
That's wonderful, Kat. I'd like to again thank you for your time and your presentation, and I might move us on to our next presentation, if that's okay. Thank you so much, Kat.
Thank you.
All right. So now this brings us to our next session. So let me pop my little notes up on my screen. So our next session is titled Youth Justice Demand Model, Implementing an Evidence-Based Knowledge Platform for Decision Making. And our presenters today are Carol, Kitson and Isaac Walsh. Carol is the Program Manager for the Youth Justice Central Region and joined Youth Justice in November 2017. She had previous career in the New Zealand Army and also New Zealand Police, and it was within these careers that she developed and successfully utilised bespoke versions of this demand model with successful outcomes. Also, we have we also have Isaac, who's originally from Brisbane, and he joined Oranga Tamaraki in early 2020. He's the Senior Business Analyst, whose data presentation and insights have proved invaluable to the Youth Justice Leadership Team and wider Youth Justice team. I welcome Carol and Isaac today. Thank you.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai. Welcome to this presentation on the Youth Justice Demand Model version 1. He aha te kai o te rangatira, he korero, he korero, he korero is a Māori whakatauki or proverb which we think emphasises the importance of this work to managers and leaders. Last year, when I changed to the Youth Justice Program Manager's role in the Central Region, I was given the opportunity to develop this decision-making tool. In my previous careers, I had developed many of these knowledge platforms, and essentially for decision-making, they advised three key things. It was the management of a finite resource efficiently, to advise the deployment of that resource where they will have the most influence or impact. And lastly, knowledge platforms allowed me to more accurately identify and mitigate risk. So this knowledge platform, or it may be referred to as KP throughout this presentation, is being trialled by the Central Youth Justice Region, but will ultimately advise our decision-making and business planning cycles across Oranga Tamariki and at every level of our structure. Finally, you may hear and see the word prevention mentioned in this presentation, and I wanted to raise that even though it is not the current focus of this particular model, my intention that this growing knowledge platform advises the application of prevention in our communities in the near future. Here we have an overview of the demand model as it's functioning. So clearly the purpose was to create this evidence-based knowledge platform. The two key outcomes of this model is to effectively use and apply the evidence base, integrate it into our business planning cycles, and secondly, to share this information with our community partner providers to enable them and empower them to support rangatahi, whānau and victims to be more successful. The phases of activity that we're currently in is we have just finalised a year's worth of collecting and configuring quite large data sets which will form our knowledge platform. In the January of next year, we'll begin profiling each of the individual sites within the trial region, constructing a regional profile as well, and those will be completed by June of next year so that they can advise the trial region's business planning cycle, which completes itself in July through that month. Then once that's been implemented, we'll continue to expand the model's process maps to include national implementation by June of 2023. A quick look at the data sets. Currently, we have 4 which we will fuse for the profiles, but we are working on the structure of a 5th. All data sets have been de-identified. We have internal and external data sets, and each of those data sets provides us with a national, regional, and site view. All the algorithms have been saved because this is a model that requires an annual update for it to remain relevant and informative. In development, as mentioned before, our 5th data set is the victims data. So each site and region will have a profile of victims corresponding to that community. Once all the data sets are merged together, they will form what we will know as a business profile at whatever site that applies to. Site again or region, or in the national profile also. A closer look at the data sets that we've created over the last year. We have essentially 4 at this stage, but a 5th as mentioned before. So the youth justice intake data, so that's drawn from our own operational database of Cyrus. And this provides most of the information for managerial decision-making around resource management and deployment. And we'll go into these data sets in a little more detail shortly. The next set of data is the wellbeing data set. Now, this is drawn from our national integrated data infrastructure database, and this holds micro data about people and households. So the data is about life events like education, income, benefits, justice, migration, and health. And the information comes from New Zealand's government agencies, statistical surveys, and there are some non-government organisations that provide information into this, into the IDI as well. The wellbeing data in particular provides a community-level vulnerability view, and this aids in identifying areas of risk and potential future demand right down to community neighbourhood levels. The next set of data is drawn from the New Zealand Police, and this provides a profile of cyclic patterns and trends of offending identified by crime type. So a key outcome of this model's development has been the closer relationships that we've formed with New Zealand Police, who are quite excited about this knowledge platform that we have going, and they are quite happy to share with us the analytical product that they produce that explains the offending drivers and enablers of each of the peaks within our communities. So this is going to be give much needed context to managers at the site level of the drivers behind their demand. The final data set is the Crime Harm Index, and this has also been drawn from New Zealand Police. This provides the degree of harm to victims from offending. We have overlaid the index across our intake data for a view of highest harm. So from a practice perspective, the data advises the type of therapeutic intervention which may be needed. And an example of this is that in any given month, a greater volume of burglary offending which has lower levels of harm requires a different response to lesser levels of, say, sexual offending, but with much higher levels of associated harm. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Isaac, to talk through in more detail the data sets.
Kia ora. So this is the version of the demand model that shows the total number of intakes each youth justice site has received each month for the past 5 years. So an intake is a referral from police or a direction from court that a child or young person is in need of a youth justice intervention. This view is useful for visualising seasonal demand and allows managers to predict upcoming demand, reprioritise resources, and manage leave within teams. It's also a useful starting point for discussing service orientation with community providers and agency partners to ensure they align to our demand cycles, and discussing concurrent demand trends with sites or regions to collaboratively understand and tackle the underlying issues. I also created 2 other views not shown here, one showing an average within each site and month over the 5 years to understand what a typical month might look like, and one showing a comparison of the most recent 12 months with the 5-year average to provide context to the current demand sites are experiencing. This is the second data set Carol spoke to, the wellbeing profile, and it uses data from a cross-agency database to estimate the wellbeing of children aged 0 to 16 in New Zealand. This model measures wellbeing using 17 different indicators within 4 domains: safety, security, wellness, and development. The example graph shows a percentage of children and young people in the Tairāwhiti community that appear within the lowest level of wellbeing for 1 or more domains. This provides a current high-level indicator of the vulnerability of a particular community. It also provides context to the intake calendar by demonstrating the poor wellbeing of communities where offending is high. So these are the 17 individual indicators within their 4 separate domains, and it shows the total number and percentage of children aged 0 to 16 that appear within each indicator. So this helps us understand the key issues within each area and helps target interventions to ensure they are focused correctly for the particular community. The highlighted indicators on this picture provide an example of the areas for concern within the Hawke's Bay, mental health, poverty, truancy from school, and chronic health conditions are among the biggest contributors to poor wellbeing. And further on the wellbeing data, this view shows how sites across the Central North Island, the trial region, how they measure for wellbeing. The higher the score, the lower the level of wellbeing within that domain. And it also highlights the overrepresentation of Māori. The third data set, the youth offending profile that the New Zealand Police have created, shows the seasonal trend for police proceedings against children and young people. This shows a slightly different picture to the intake model, as not all police proceedings are referred to oranga tamariki, and some are dealt with via an alternative action. This view is also useful at demonstrating how necessary it is that we use community-level data as opposed to regional data. Offending trends at the community level, the bottom table in this picture, differ significantly from the area or district levels. And finally, the crime harm index data. I incorporated the crime harm index data from the police to better understand the complexity within the cases that sites were dealing with. The crime harm index scores each crime based on the number of days a person is typically sentenced, and is similar to the index developed in Western Australia, which uses the same type of sentencing information as New Zealand. This provides a more realistic representation of the work required from each site and the length of time spent on each case. This is particularly useful for evaluating the need for a new service and ensuring demand numbers are not considered in isolation. Using this information in combination with the youth justice intake data provides greater insight into the potential drivers of offending patterns. The data allows us to determine the most frequent charges laid and target intervention work more specifically. The crime harm index data was applied so that it multiplied the intake numbers by a factor determined by the calculated crime harm in the community during that month. The overall trend did not change dramatically, although the communities that previously appeared similar in demand now more accurately reflect the differing level of need.
So progress to date, although we're not in the trial business application phase, once we had drawn down the demand data in particular from our own internal database, we realised that we could be making some decisions and posturing differently just on that data itself. So the cyclic demand data that we've pulled together has allowed us to do some immediate local restructuring. So we've merged some management boundaries, which has worked very successfully. We've now had an ability to review our workforce posture and the deployment of staff, i.e. when do coordinators, when do youth workers and when do social workers need to be positioned throughout the year. We've created knowledgeable staff conversations with the data evidence that we've drawn. We can now acknowledge that we need to support across our own boundaries those neighbouring sites within our region because we see the differences in our demand levels. We've also been able to give deployment direction to our partner service providers so that they align better with our demand calendars. And we've also created internally a far greater understanding of the importance of accurate data entry. Finally, the police data has evidenced what we previously anecdotally knew about our communities. So managers with the analytical product that police will provide in the future, they will gain a greater insight into the cycles of youth offending within their communities, create a greater understanding of the wider cycles of offending and the impact that this has on youth offending also. And now we've created a view of victim harm associated with those offending cycles. So if we want to apply the model across our decision-making and influence spectrum, it's been divided into four just broadly so that we can see where will the model, how will the model be applied and what sort of influence do we think we'll have within each of those spectrums. So at the front line, clearly we can respond more accurately to our workforce demand cycles. more accurate staffing ratio and deployment and postures. We can identify opportunities for sharing our staffing resource. We can align our community partner providers to our demand more accurately, and the information within this knowledge profile informs our local and our oranga tamariki shift to Māori-centred approaches. Within the strategic planning spectrum, we can identify annual staff development opportunities, opportunities for sharing resource cross-region, opportunities to coordinate local and regional prevention initiatives. Within the community development spectrum, we can identify through the information gathered, say in the wellbeing profile, we've now identified community harm and what the needs might be. We can develop the right service to meet that need. We can deploy our community services to the right place, in the right type, at the right time and in the right amount. And we can also inform our iwi and hapu-led intervention and prevention initiatives. In the all of government spectrum, the evidence base provides an evidence base, I should say, to partner for wider prevention. There's increased information sharing relationships, and the knowledge platform provides a platform for future cooperation. That is the final slide in our presentation. We are now open for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carol and Isaac. A really informative session. We can see such broad application of this model across so many different domains and areas, and how this would be really valuable for our strategic plans, thinking and decision making. So really want to thank you for sharing that model. I was curious, I've just asked one of our people in the background whether we could share some of those slides, because I could see myself wanting just to pause and sort of look at it line by line and see some of those results. So we'll see if we can share those slides, if that's possible. Carol and Isaac, is that possible?
Can we go back?
Yeah, of course. Did you want us to go back to them now, or?
Oh no, not at all. No, all good. I will just
Okay.
see if we can maybe share them broadly for those that want to have those slides as well.
Yeah,
but I will
No
turn
problem.
to question and answer here, and I'm really happy that the internet has held off, because you've been flashing on the screen a little bit, so really pleased that we could continue to hear you through the whole presentation, which is great. Let me see if I can just quickly go to some of the questions. We are a little bit over time. The session was started a little late, so we might have to go into our break time. So let's see if we can get through some of these questions as quick as possible, and then we'll be able to answer those questions in the chat when you come out of the presentation as well. But look, we do have a question here around could you tell us how you are measuring the degree of harm for victims?
You can.
Yeah. So the victim data set is still in development. So we haven't incorporated the harm information alongside the victim information. So the harm information is currently just coming from the crime harm index, which is based on the number of days sentenced for a particular crime. So ranging from low level of harm crimes, administrative crimes, up to murder at the top. Yeah, so no, we don't have a current measure of harm for victims at the moment.
Okay, Isaac, I might ask one more question here. Can you tell us if the presence of a neurodiversity is taken into account with the data?
Did you want to answer?
You go. Yeah, we're going to.
Yeah, not currently. There's a program of work with Youth Justice at the moment to look at neurodiversity and how we can link that into our current work. But at the moment, it is just based on the volumes of crime coming through and the level of harm to the community. So we haven't got that level of detail on it yet. No. Yeah.
You never know. And it probably leads us to our next question. Has there been any discoveries in the data that surprised you?
We could talk a bit, I suppose, about the impact of COVID, and how we looked for the impact that COVID would have on the 5-year averages in particular. But if anything, it was just a lesser volume. And I was quite surprised that because we were supposedly in lockdown, that would have a more dramatic impact. However, we had the conversations also that by the time we review next year, that will be 3 years essentially of COVID potential influence, and that may choose a different a view forward for what demand would look like for us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Look, we probably have time quickly for one last question. Are Pacific statistics as high as Maori in the youth justice area?
No. No. On percentage of Pacific children and young people in New Zealand, it's a little more similar, but as a percentage of the total population of children and young people in the youth justice system, it's much lower. Māori is definitely the highest represented ethnicity. And Pakeha or New Zealand European would be higher than Pacific as total numbers. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, Carol and Isaac, that brings us to the end of your session. I just want to again thank you for your time and for sharing the really interesting modelling that you've undertaken. I will ask you to go back into the other room, and perhaps if you could just take some time to answer. There are a couple more questions in the chat, and if we can get those answered, that would be great. Thank you, Carol.
Awesome.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
Lovely. Well, look, that does bring us to our last presentation for this session. And this is in relation to building strong and trusted relationships and meeting the needs of rangatahi and Whānau. And so I'd like to warmly welcome Liz Marsden and Juliet Erihe. Liz Marsden has worked for more than 40 years in both the social services sector in government and non-government agencies, including various teaching roles, and is currently the CEO with Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services. Juliet Erihe has also worked in the social services sector for over 20 years in a variety of settings, including health, government, and the NGO sector. She's currently working as the Director of Operations for Kiawa Pahawai Youth Horizons. I warmly welcome Liz and Juliet. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou. Ko te wehe ki te atu o Rungarawa, nāna ngā mea katoa i hunga. E ngā rauranga tirama, ngā kaiwhakawā o tēnei huihuinga, e mihi nui kia koutou. Nā koutou ngā kohatu mātauranga mō ngā whānau, ngā hapu hoki, o tēnei whenua, mō ngā rā e heke mai nei, i arahi i tautoko. Ko Liz Marsden ahau i te taha tōku pāpā, ko tangikura te maunga, ko Wairohia te awa, ko Ngāti Korokoro me Ngāti Whararanga hapu, ko Ngāpuhi nui tonu te iwi. I te taha o tōku māma, ko te whānau apanui, whakatohia me te aitanga maha ki ngā iwi. Tēnā koutou mō koutou mahi āwhina. I also acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Kia ora koutou. Kei a koe Juliet.
Tuatahi ko te tautoko i ngā mihi kua mihia i a tuakana kia koutou. Kua tau mai nei i runga te tēnei kaupapa o tātou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko wai au, ko manaia te maunga, ko tēringa parawa te moana, ko ngungaru te awa, ko Ngāti Wai, Ngāpuhi, Ngā iwi, ko Patu Harakiki, Ngāti Taka, Ngā hapu, ko Juliet Erihe, tōku ingoa. Over to you, Liz.
I've got no sound. Oh, good. I couldn't hear Juliet. Kia ora. So, kia ora, Juliet. You're through your pepeha? Yeah. Juliet?
Yes, can you hear me?
Juliet, I'd like to though. All right. So we're talking about the theme of ours, a strong and trusted relationship, meeting the needs of rangatahi, young people and whānau family. So as Juliet will have explained, she works for Youth Horizons, Kia Puawai, and I work for Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services. Our two organisations formed a relationship in 2012, and that was brought about by the need for us in Taitokera up in the far north to access specialist services that weren't previously available to us, but they were being provided by Youth Horizons Trust. And so Youth Horizons had been asked to provide services up in Taitokera, but when they started to do that, they realised that they'd probably have greater engagement if they came and sought a mandate from Ngāpuhi, the largest iwi in the country, but also covering a significant part of Taitokera. And so led by kaumātua from Tainui, Youth Horizons Trust came north back in 2012 to seek that mandate from Te Runanga Āiwi o Ngāpuhi to provide specialist services in Taitokera. Prior to that, our taitamariki and their whānau often had to travel to Auckland to receive these services. The Ngāpuhi Runanga supported this kaupapa to better cover Taitokera, and we brought in all Tāngarei Trust based in Whangarei because we had a bit of a gap in that Whangarei area. The Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services actually based in Kaikohe. So to get better coverage, we brought in all Tāngarei Trust as well. So there were three organisations that actually developed the joint venture that was referred to as Te Pai Aronga Taitamaniki. Over the next few years, Te Pai Aronga introduced and managed several new services in Taitokera, and Juliet will talk a bit more about some of those. In 2019, just before the last conference, AYJC conference held in Sydney, YHT heard about an FFTCW program that had been running in Canberra. And Ozchild, at the request of Goulburn Youth Aboriginal Corporation, provided FFTCW for just over 6 months and had achieved remarkable results for Aboriginal families, particularly families who were at risk of having their tamariki uplifted. There was a huge decrease in the number of uplifts at that time through this intervention involving FFTCW and Aboriginal whānau. NISA's interest in that was sparked by the difficulty in accessing a similar service up here in Taitokera. So we went down to Canberra, saw it in action, saw the program in action, very impressed. Came back, and the CEO of YHT and I, with Juliet's help, of course, put in a proposal to Oranga Tamariki to fund an FFTCW program up here in Taitokera. That was back in 2019, not long after we got back from the last conference. And we've been live and delivering that in Taitokera since January this year. Kei a koe, Juliet.
So I think that brings us to talk a little bit about, the relationship, like Liz had said, was a long-standing relationship. There'd been various times throughout the year or years where we'd worked together and not worked together. So there was an element of trust already there. For Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services, what Youth Horizons or Kia Puawai brought to the relationship was a strong history of delivering FFT in the context of Aotearoa. And so it was 2009 when the model originally came after a group from Youth Horizons had seen a blueprints presentation regarding it. And so thinking that this was something that might be useful there was a lot of kind of due diligence done by the internal people at Youth Horizons, both on the board of trustees and our kaumātua, about whether it would be fit for purpose in Aotearoa. And then a process occurred where it was taken down to Kahotia Marae, and the developers spoke to a lineup of kaumātua and kuia down there about the model, and this was done on the premise that if they thought that it wasn't right, then it wouldn't come. And the reason for that is at that time, Kia Pōwa was delivering services predominantly in Tainui Rohi, and so it was appropriate that we would go to there. And so we had that kind of long history and that knowledge around trying, working, being diverse. And I think tomorrow there's a group talking about Pai Whakatupuranga, which is another version of FFT that's delivered in Aotearoa, and that talks a little bit more to the whakapapa of FFT in this country. So we kind of knew that it fitted, and that it made sense because it focuses first on building relationships and hope and all of those other really important things before we even start talking about what the dreams for the future are for Whānau. And we also knew that because it's an evidence-based model, if we do it the way it's done, then we'll get the kind of outcomes we were looking for. Things like reductions in offending, reductions in challenging behaviour, increase in supportive whānau interactions. And we were seeing some kind of side benefits of reductions in family harm incidents, although it was very early stages to be looking at that. But also to ensure that we were doing the right thing. In 2016, a study was conducted by Hayward and David Ferguson, and they were looking at 5 areas of FFT. So 2 of them were understanding if we were getting the same outcomes delivering FFT in Aotearoa for Māori and for non-Māori whānau. The other one was looking at whether they felt that we were culturally responsive to the needs of the whānau, both Māori and non-Māori. And then the 5th one was whether adherence to model fidelity had significant impacts on the outcome. That 5th one was difficult to look at because there was a high incidence of therapist adherence, so there wasn't really much fluctuation there. But what we did see with the other 4 areas, that in the outcomes, both Māori and non-Māori whānau were seeing very similar outcomes. It was slightly higher for non-Māori, but very marginal. And then in cultural satisfaction, we were seeing that 80 to 90% of Māori whānau were confident or satisfied with the cultural responsiveness of the therapy they were receiving. So those experiences and knowledges and years of delivering the model meant that we could bring our trial and errors to the table with our relationship with Ngāpuhi Social Services. We also had a long-standing relationship with the model developers in the US, and as such we're able to facilitate some introductions and kind of getting to know each other. And we had built over time a lot of trust with those developers, with the processes and the ways we'd engage with them. So that was something that was really helpful. We were also able, because we were already delivering, to stand a service up really quickly. So we already had a couple of therapists, and we were looking predominantly at expansion in a slightly more northern area. And so that was an easy progressive next step for us to do. So it brings me on to my next discussion. What are the benefits of partnership, or why did this happen in partnership? And I think, one of the key things is that joint knowledge together and shared expertise be better for whānau and for our rangatahi. We all have strengths and areas that we have experience in delivering in, and I think if we merge those together on a foundation of trust with one another, we can really grow what we do. And so for us, the knowledge we could share with Ngāpuhi Social Services was around the infrastructure needed to deliver a model like this. What are some of the learnings? And there's a little picture there of Te Huarahi o Te Rangatahi, which is a manual we've developed in relation to our Pai Whakatupuranga team, which integrates both Western and Indigenous knowledge into kind of one way of delivering service. So some of our experiences we could share. And then for us from Ngāpuhi, so many benefits, things like an understanding of, or a greater, deeper understanding and appreciation for the tikanga within the cultural support, the fact that they're very seated in that community. And so by wanting to work with us, the community built more trust with us in a very quick way, as opposed to being suspicious of a new person coming into that community. So I think we grow capacity in both services. It also gave us the ability to improve our response to community need. Previously, all of our referrals had needed to come through government services, and by partnering with Ngāpuhi and Oranga Tamariki giving the okay for Ngāpuhi to refer Whānau and rangatahi that they thought needed the service without needing government intervention, really made a big difference in helping to keep people back from the cliff edge, helping to get involved when, say, the police are saying Johnny's kind of going downhill and we think we're going to see more of him, and the community people are saying, look, the whānau needs some support around therapeutic intervention. And you kind of get that marry up of actually we can do something, we can refer to something that we know is effective, that we know will be helpful. So getting in at that early stage is really, really important, and being able to listen to what communities historically intensive therapeutic interventions were not easy for communities to access in the mid-north. So those are some of the huge benefits of that partnership. The other thing we saw is there's a cultural engagement role that sits alongside this team. So you've got two therapists that work with whānau who deliver FFT, and then you have the cultural advisor role that works with whānau prior to them engaging with the therapist, and they work with the referrer internally in Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services. And that role is an expert in tikanga, they're an expert in community, and they really offer to bridge the gap between those two worlds. So they would sit with the referrer and explain what they're referring to. They would sit with the whānau and explain what they're signing up to. They'd done the full FFT training. They sat in the team for team meetings. They're very much a part of both teams. And one of the key things we've seen, and it's really early stages, so we can't definitively say this is an effect of that, but prior to having that role in this way of taking referrals, we were seeing about 40% of whānau wouldn't progress into treatment. At this stage, and of course we've only had 16 whānau referred, but we've got 88% of them progressing on to treatment. And of those, the two that aren't, one of them's moved areas and the other one had a lot going on at the time and wanted to defer till later. So they're very kind of still interested reasons. And we think that's because when whānau are referred, they really feel like they're allowed to make a choice and they're making an informed one. So we're really about the emerging engagement that we're seeing. I mean, it might be due to a variety of different things as well. One, that we're getting referrals earlier and directly from the community. It could be that it's the child welfare version of FFT, which works with a younger cohort as well. But even then, I think these numbers are really good, and I'm feeling really hopeful about the way things are going. And so is it working for whānau? And I suppose that is the most important question. And there's a couple of quotes on here that I really like. One is about the hui that a social worker called and bringing all of the whānau together to genuinely make a decision if therapy was right for them. And I really liked this because the idea for most of our whānau that are involved with government services or involved with the police or involved in, there's a feeling of powerlessness about what they can make decisions around. And that happens because they feel like they just need to say yes to everything often so that everybody just goes away. Whereas by taking time and really observing and listening and sharing, they were able to decide whether it was right for them. And the feedback was like it was a true experience of their ability to self-determine what they felt was right. And they proceeded, and they've really enjoyed it, and they've really participated, and they've stayed engaged, which was really unusual for this whānau. And then one of the other aspects, I think, that comes from being able to engage with both the cultural advisor and the team at Ngāpuhi, that's really made a significant difference. And I think this is the one thing I'm really keen future and look back and see, because we suspected it would. But we've got access to a whānau worker or a social worker that's already working with that whānau. We've got a cultural advisor that takes care of the tikanga and engaging with that whānau. And then we've got a therapist working on some new ways of relating to one another, seeing the strength in themselves, improving their relational skills with each other. And those three things seem to work together to address the varying aspects. So if something like housing is a problem, or kai is a problem, or there's difficulties navigating the systems that sit, we have a social worker or whānau worker that's supporting the whānau with that. So their resourcing is improved, and they're being able to access the things they need for their physical well-being. And then we have a therapist who's working with them, building hope for the future. They're seeing the strength in each other. They're looking more positively, and they're engaging with the community slightly differently from that hopefulness and that progress. And so you have the two working really beautifully together, where I feel better about the world is behaving better towards me, and I can then navigate that with support in a much more significant way. And we think that's why we're seeing whānau remaining engaged with this particular FFT. Normally for a new team like this, you'd expect only 70% would make it through to the end. And with this particular team, we're seeing, everybody who started is still engaged, which is amazing. We've only had 2 completed so far, but nobody looks like they're not going to. I think the key messages from that is by meeting multiple needs at the same time, we're able to have a much more, what I think is effective engagement and effective intervention. And the proof will be in the long-term picture if we continue to work like this, when we look back and see if the changes have been made there. And so that brings me to the last little bit. And I just wanted to share this whakatauki, e hara takitahi, engari takutoa he toa takitini. And it really talks to how important the collective is. The whānau is the people who can direct their own future, the community being responsive together to meet the needs that they see, and everybody working in partnership. Thank you.
Wonderful.
All.
Thank you so much, Juliet and Liz. Some really good takeaway messages for the early results and the different things that we can share with great that you had that small idea that came from the previous conference, and now it's actually translated into a program for so many families. So well done, and thank you, Juliet and Liz. We are really tight on time. I'm wondering whether if there are any questions, if people can pop them into the chat, that would be great. And then Juliet and Liz can answer some questions in the chat room. It does bring us to the end of this particular session. And what we'll ask is that everyone gets up, has a bit of a break, has a cup of tea, stretches their legs, and gets back into the main room at New Zealand time 12:50, Australian Eastern Standard Time at 10:50. So maybe a 10-minute break for everyone. But again, thank you, Juliet and Liz, really informative, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next session. Thank you so much. Enjoy.
Hei kona.